Hello, nice to meet you. Where you been? Welcome to this video on developmental psychology for the AQA GCSE psychology course. This video is going to be revision, so I'm going to go quickly through each of the different areas of the developmental psychology topic, and so hopefully that will help you with some revision if you've got an assessment coming up. So first off in the course, you start looking at early brain development. So that is biologically how we develop. Remember, this whole topic is about developmental psychology, how children develop literally from conception right the way through the up to actually developmental psychology generally goes to early adulthood, but this course mainly focuses on childhood. So the areas of the brain that you need to know about are the brain stem. You should have an understanding that that's to do with motor and sensory functions, autonomic functions. So autonomic functions are things that you don't consciously think about: your breathing, your blinking, your heart rate, those sorts of things. And the brain stem is fully developed at birth, so it's at the base, the top of the spine, at the base of the brain. The cerebellum, so it's got little brain energy. So again, that's sensory and motor activity. So that deals with things as well. It looks at balance, coordination, movement. There's some language and emotion functions in there. So this actually matures a bit later when the child gets a bit older, and you can understand that. So a child obviously getting more complex in their language and their emotion, that comes a bit later on, so the cerebellum develops later. The thalamus, it's kind of walnut shaped, it's in both hemispheres of the brain. Remember, the hemisphere is the side of the brain, and it's kind of known as the hub, the information hub. So it sends and receives information to other areas of the body. So for example, it will receive sensory information from the eye, from the retina, and send it to the visual cortex in the brain. It does similar with motor signals in the motor cortex and receiving it from the spinal cord and brainstem. You've then got the cortex, the outer bark like a tree, not like a dog, bark of the brain linked to thinking, so thinking's cognition and processing. You've then got the frontal cortex, that's kind of the behind your forehead, and that's to do with thinking, cognition, so that's a higher order thinking. It's kind of what makes us humans. You've got the visual and auditory cortices, plural cortex, and that's to do with sensory information. So again, it's sensory and motor, so movement, motor cortex, and again that develops throughout our lives and keeps on developing. The final part looking at brain development is the idea you have to have an understanding of the difference between nature and nurture. So nature being what we're born with, what's inherited, our genetic code, and then nurture, the impact of the environment. And this can be tested using twin studies. Obviously there's been in the past very, very unethical studies where they've separated twins at birth to look at what effect there is on the genes compared to the environment of identical twins or triplets. In reality, it's obviously unethical to do that, so that doesn't happen anymore. And there's a kind of what's known as an interactionist approach taken by psychologists. So this means that psychologists generally now understand that there's some impact of nurture and some impact of nature. So you're born with maybe a predisposition, a potential to get maybe a mental health problem or an addiction or something like that, but it's your environment that may trigger that or not, depending on what your environment's like. So after early brain development, we then started looking at Piaget's theory. Piaget's theory has several different areas to it. The main concepts of it, I'm going to look at the AO1, the information and knowledge and understanding, and the AO3 of each of these other areas. So you need to have an idea of what schemas are. So schemas are kind of packets of information, how we store information in the brain, the different processes within schemas. So you've got assimilation, which is adapting an old schema to account for new information, or accommodation, where you need to create a new schema because that new information is so different from your original schema. And Piaget, his big thing was looking at stages of development. So there was a sensory motor stage between 0 and 2 years. This is where something known as object permanence develop. So to begin with, children don't understand that when something is hidden from view, it still exists. That develops in this stage. You've then got the pre-operational stage. So this is between 2 and 7 years. At this point, the child is egocentric, and so they have egocentrism and they lack conservation. So, and we'll look later on to the two named studies in this topic. You need to know about the aim, method, results and conclusion, and evaluation of two particular studies. That's the McGarrigle and Donaldson and the Hughes study. Talk about that in a moment, but that's what they tested. So egocentrism, seeing things from other people's point of view, and conservation. So conservation of number, that was the counters task, or conservation of volume, that was the flasks task. So children can't do that at the start of the pre-operational stage. They develop to become less egocentric and understand conservation through that stage. Next is the concrete operational stage. This is between 7 and 11 years. This is where, so concrete meaning physical things, operational logic. So this is where they can develop physical ideas they're quite good with, but maybe abstract ideas, things like morality and justice and things like that they would struggle more with. But that would come later on, finally at the formal stage. This is over 11 years old, and this is where they can deal with abstract ideas, logical thinking, the scientific method, looking at things like algebra, things like that. So that's Piaget's theory in general. As an evaluation then, is this a good theory or not? What do we know about Piaget? Well, at the basic, there is some support. So McGarrigle and Donaldson and Hughes, so two studies we'll talk about in more detail at the moment, they did support to an extent, not completely, but they supported to an extent what Piaget was saying, and that was the fact that children do seem to develop as they get older. They develop in stages as they get older, and so that was supported in both of those studies. So McGarrigle and Donaldson was looking at conservation, and Hughes was looking at egocentrism. While they contradicted Piaget in some respects, they supported him in the fact that the developmental stages are things. Another weakness of Piaget's theory is that he probably underestimated children's ability. So we'll look at those studies. So they weren't as egocentric, or they weren't as good at, they were better at conservation than Piaget would have said. So that's a criticism of Piaget's studies. At the same time, he also overestimated children's ability. So looking at the formal stage, he said children should be able to reason and have debates and be really scientific and logical. Well, lots of adults aren't even that logical at times, and so actually he may have overstated what an 11-year-old or 12-year-old might be able to do. So looking into some of these studies then, firstly, McGarrigle and Donaldson. So this is a named study on the specification, which means you need to be able to know the aim, method, results, conclusion. You could get asked about any of those, and you need to be able to evaluate this study. As we've already seen, you can use these studies as evaluations of other parts of this topic anyway, but that helps. So McGarrigle and Donaldson, they did what was known as a Naughty Teddy study. This was another test of conservation. So conservation, the idea that children know that numbers are the same even if they might look different. That was the counters task. So 4 or 5 counters in a row, if they look the same amount, they're going to say they're the same amount. When Piaget or a researcher manipulated one to look bigger and one to look smaller, they're going to say the one that looks bigger, even though there's the same amount of counters, has more in. So that's a lack of conservation. As children get older, they understand that things can look different but still have the same amount or same volume. So what McGarrigle and Donaldson did, they said, okay, well, maybe part of the reason why the children said that they had more counters in when actually they didn't was because they saw the researcher change the amounts. They might have thought that the researcher wanted them to say that it had a different amount. Okay, let's test this. How are we going to test this in a way that children... So that was their aim, to test whether children react differently if it was an accidental change in the look than on purpose. So what can you do? Well, they did this using a teddy, which is why it's called the Naughty Teddy study, and they had the teddy accidentally change the counters. So the researcher moved the teddy around the research area, and in doing so moved the counters, and then asked the children. They did this in Edinburgh. They had 80 children, 40 were from a nursery, 40 were from the same primary school, and that was the method of the study. What did they find? Well, they found that when they repeated what Piaget had done, so the researcher purposely changed the counters, only 41% of the children were able to say that it was the same amount of counters. So there was more wrong answers. Whereas when it was the teddy, 68% were able to correctly say that it's the same amount of counters. So using the teddy improved the outcomes there. What they also found was that the primary school children were better than the nursery school children. So those were the results of the findings. What can we conclude from this? Well, there's two main conclusions. One, Piaget may have underestimated what children can do. Children in this study performed better at conservation than they did in Piaget's study. So children might be better at conservation than Piaget first thought. And so maybe McGarrigle and Donaldson were correct in that it was the setup of that study caused the results rather than the children not being able to conserve. What they also found was that the older children were better. So this actually supported Piaget's theory. So it's not black and white saying it goes against or it supports. Part of the findings supported what Piaget was saying. Part of the findings suggested that it maybe wasn't completely accurate. So that's your AO1 for this study. Evaluating it then, is it a good study or not? Remember, with all these evaluations, you're going to need to make a point, evaluate that point and conclude that point. I've just listed them here in shorter bullet points to try to help you to remember them. You would need to elaborate on them if you get a longer question on these. So for a strength, so it's a good thing that this study challenges Piaget's theory. We want that in science. We want theories, ideas to be put out and then tested again and look at whether we've got consistent results. The fact that it goes against Piaget's study, it's obviously maybe a negative of Piaget's theory, but it's a strength of this study that it follows the scientific method and allows us to test a pre-existing idea. However, not all plain sailing. So there was an issue here. There was a small sample. So the sample is the participants that took part in the study. In this case, it was 80 children from Edinburgh. They were only from one place. There was only 80 of them, and all the primary school children were from the same school. So actually that says, well, okay, maybe it was just the children at this school. There was something about that. Their teacher might have taught them how to conserve, and so they appeared like they're better. We can't apply those results to all children across the world. So that is potentially an issue of this study. The other issue is obviously McGarrigle and Donaldson criticised Piaget's method and the way that he conducted the study. Well, actually, you could say some of the researchers thought that actually the way that McGarrigle and Donaldson did it, the children may not have even noticed that it was a different amount of counters. That it was the same amount of counters that they had changed because they might have been focusing on the teddy. So again, their results might not actually reflect whether the children can conserve or not. It could just be a setup of this method, the way that the study was conducted. So that's worth taking into account. The second study named on the specification, so again you need to know the A method results and conclusion for your AO1 and be able to evaluate it, is Hughes' study. Hughes' study looks into more detail at egocentrism. I already mentioned egocentrism when looking at Piaget's stages. So Hughes criticised Piaget's theory of and method of looking at egocentrism. So Piaget used what's known as the 3 mountains task. They asked children what they could see compared to what a researcher could see in the 3 mountains. What Piaget found was that younger children certainly would say what they could see rather than what the researchers could actually see when they were asked what could the researchers see. So Piaget said that this meant that they were egocentric, they were looking at things from their own point of view. Hughes was saying that actually maybe this was quite misleading for the children. They didn't understand it. It's quite an unusual task. They might not have looked at mountains before. It had a church and things on it. It was quite an unusual setup. So Hughes said, okay, well, if we make this more culturally understandable, more socially understandable for the children, will that impact the outcome? Might children be better? That was the aim. How do you do it? Again, it was children from Edinburgh. There were 30 of them this time. They were aged between 3.5 and 5 years old. And what happened is they presented children, it's called the Policeman doll study. They presented children with a policeman doll, a boy doll. There were 2 cross walls, and the policeman wasn't able to see over the wall. So the researcher helped them look through and helped them see, okay, could the policeman see the doll if he was here or here or here or here? They should understand the task, and then the child was then asked to hide the boy doll from the policeman doll. And that was the setup. And the idea was that if they could do that, it suggests that they're not egocentric because they can see things from other people's point of view. What did they find? 90% of the children were able to hide the boy doll from the Policeman doll, and again the older children outperform the younger children. So that's the statistics, the results. What does this mean? Well, again, much like the other study, it suggests that Piaget may have thought children were less developed than they were. So Hughes is suggesting that children were able to perform better on egocentrism than Piaget would. So it challenges Piaget's idea. However, it also supports Piaget's idea again because the older children again outperform the younger children. So it does look like there is a fair bit of support here for Piaget and his idea that we develop as we get older in stages cognitively. So that part of the theory has been supported. In terms of this study then, Hughes' study, how do we evaluate that? And again, you'd need to elaborate on all of these points, but to try to help you remember. So the strength here, the design of the study is more relatable to the children. It makes more sense to them socially, and so might be a better test of are they actually egocentric or not. And again, it's a good thing that this challenges Piaget's ideas because it's research. We want to be able to test research, and it's good that we don't just take what Piaget said for granted. The negative is that there's some suggestion that the researcher could potentially have given away hints as to what the answers they wanted were, and so again, is it completely accurate? Again, is the method of the study completely sound and led to solid results? And that's still questionable. Okay, next then, we need to be able to apply Piaget's theory to education, and that's been done in a few ways. So three kind of general principles. So that's the idea of readiness. So for AO1, Piaget didn't actually apply his own theories, but people have done that in the past. Very, very applicable and has had real world application. We'll look at that when we come to evaluation. But what would Piaget's theory, how can teachers, educationalists apply Piaget's theory? Well, they would say that children should only be taught things when they're ready to do so. So link into those stages, we'll look at that in a second, but you shouldn't try to teach things in an order that would confuse children. Next is that children should learn by discovery. They should be finding things out on their own. They should be exploring their environment and given the opportunity to look at things and discover. And then finally, individual learning. So you should look at where the individual child is in the developmental stage and adapt the teaching, adapt what they're accessing to that individual child. And that's had an impact. Before Piaget, actually everyone was taught exactly the same thing at exactly the same time, and that has changed since Piaget. Looking then more specifically at applying the different stages to education, what we would say is for the sensory motor stage, because as the name suggests, it's sensory, looking at the senses and motor movement. So we should make the child's environment applicable to that. So it should be stimulating. There should be things to stimulate the senses, touch and sound, and there should be areas for them to move and develop their sensory motor skills. In the pre-operational stage, this is where children, we say that they certainly begin egocentric and lack of conservation. So we can help them with that. We can get them to see things from other people's points of view. So dress up and role play could really help there. Work with quantity, and so numbers and maths could really help to develop their conservation skills. Moving on to the concrete stage, this is where they could be given physical things to actually that they can see and touch and relate to, because they're this concrete operational where things have to be actually there and viewable. So plasticine, things like that, things that they can actually get their hands on and work with. And then in the formal operational stage, that's where things like scientific tasks and bigger discussions, the meaning of life, that sort of thing, might be able to discuss with children above 11 years old if you're applying Piaget's theory. In evaluation then, strengths and weaknesses. The strengths are that it is very applicable, and actually governments even looked at Piaget's theories and did apply them, and the education system, certainly in the UK, changed after the 60s using Piaget's theory, so it was very influential. Not all good though, as we've seen as we go through. So Piaget would say you should only, again, he didn't personally apply his theories, but people using his theories would say you should only introduce children to things when they're ready to develop. Well, actually, what has been found is that you can introduce children to things a bit earlier on, and they can practice them and get better. So it's not as maybe as strict as some people might have thought in terms of those ages and stages. And also, what we mentioned there, discovery learning, and children should learn by discovery. Again, that's kind of been debunked and discredited, and there's lots of research saying direct instruction is helpful. If you were to say to someone learning maths, okay, well, go and find out your quadratic equations on your own, discover that. Children need the basic principles. They need to be taught things directly first before the discovery can happen. So a mixed approach is probably the best one to take in that situation. Moving on then, and then towards the end of the topic, you start looking at Dweck's theory, so Dweck's mindset theory. So this is the idea that there are two mindsets. A fixed mindset believes that people don't get better, that you're born with your ability, whether that's sporting or musical or academic, whereas a growth mindset thinks that those that put effort into things can get better, that if you embrace challenge, you're going to develop yourself further and things will improve. The impact of failure will have a different impact on these different people. So if you've got a fixed mindset, failure is going to confirm your idea that you're no good at it and shouldn't try. Whereas if you've got a growth mindset, you're going to see failure as a chance to improve and learn on what you've done before. And you can maybe train people to be a bit more growth in their mindset. Mindsets are also a continuum, so you can be very or some fixed, and you can be growth in one area and fixed in another. There's also this link to praise, esteem, and self-efficacy. So praise is good, but if you're praising the effort rather than the outcome, and if the praise is deserved, that's when it works best. Whereas if someone is praised all the time, regardless of what they do for their outcome, what it means is that could reduce their motivation. They're going to think, well, I'm going to get praised anyway, or if you're not going to praise me, I'm not going to do any work. So you don't want to just praise indiscriminately. Praise needs to be used appropriately, and self-efficacy is our idea of how good we are at something. That comes from our experiences of it. It comes from what people think of us as it, and if you've got high self-efficacy, you're more likely to try something which then might make you better at it. So we can develop people's self-efficacy by giving them appropriate challenges. They can then feel good about meeting those challenges, and then you increase the challenge as you go on. Strengths and weaknesses for Dweck's theory then. So there's lots of research support for the mindsets model from Dweck and others. And there's also numerous applications in terms of academics, sport, music, relationships, lots of areas where if you put more effort in, you're going to do better. However, as we've said, praise isn't always good and actually can have a detrimental impact, can be negative. And you need to be aware of that. It could lead to less motivation rather than more. And then finishing off then, looking at learning styles and Willingham's theories. So learning styles, this is the idea that if you match the way that people prefer to learn with the way that they're taught, they have better outcomes. So you could have verbalizers who like to hear things or read things or work in words, visualizers who like visual things, maps, pictures, graphs, diagrams, or kinesthetic learners who like to learn by doing. It's a nice idea, and so a strength is it develops the traditional methods. However, big criticisms here. There's no research support, so no evidence for it, and actually it could have a detrimental or bad impact. It could be negative in terms of learning and development. And also there were thought to be about 71 different learning styles, so it's quite impossible to match everyone's learning style with a teaching method, so it makes it very impractical as well. Willingham was a critic of learning styles. Willingham focused on scientific evidence, and because there was no scientific evidence for learning styles, Willingham disagreed with it. Instead, he said you can focus on other cognitive psychology or neuroscience. So as we mentioned with praise, it should be unexpected, it should be deserved, and that's when it works best. Looking back to the memory topic, if you learn things with the cues, that's really helpful for you, and also retrieval practice can be helpful. So retrieving information, practicing doing that can help you to actually learn it, because that's the way you're going to be assessed on things. Self-regulation, Willingham thought self-regulation was important as well. So regulating your behaviour, your emotion, delayed gratification are all good things that can help development and learning. And he suggested that brain patterns and neuroscience could have a positive impact on learning, classroom and development. Strengths here, so it's an evidence-based approach. There is lots of research to back all of this up. That's where it came from, and that was his starting point. So that's really, really positive. And as well as this, there's instant real-world applications, so you can apply this to lots of areas, sport, academia, etc. The one criticism here is that neuroscience at the moment is probably quite early to be able to apply directly, certainly for a classroom practitioner, and you'd need more expertise to do that. So it might be of little practical use at the moment in the classroom, and might not help with early identification. Okay, I hope that was helpful. Nice overview of the whole topic. Good luck if you've got an assessment coming up. Peace out.